The engine was cold when Ethan Brooks finally pulled into his driveway at 11:40 on a Thursday night. For a few seconds, he stayed behind the wheel with the truck off and the darkness pressing against the windows. The neighborhood was asleep. The only light came from the living room window of his small house, a faint blue glow from the television that told him exactly what he already knew. Mrs. Pett had fallen asleep waiting for him again. Ethan rubbed a grease-stained hand across the back of his neck and let out a slow breath. Another late night. Another promise to be home earlier that hadn't survived contact with reality. Brooks' mechanical solutions sounded impressive on paper. In reality, it was 6 employees, a leased warehouse off Route 9, and a constant struggle to keep projects moving when suppliers missed deadlines and clients demanded miracles. Ethan specialized in miracles, or at least that was what people told him. Whenever a machine was considered impossible to fix, whenever a project had been abandoned by people with better credentials and bigger companies, somebody eventually called Ethan Brooks. It paid the bills. It also kept him away from home more than he liked. Inside, Mrs. Pette woke with a start when he opened the door. The elderly woman blinked at him, glanced at the clock, and immediately started gathering her things. "Boy ate good," she said before he could apologize. "Eggs, toast, 2 glasses of milk, asked where you were 3 times. Ethan smiled weakly. "Sorry. Don't apologize to me." She pointed toward the hallway. "He's a patient kid, Ethan. Don't make him spend all that patience before he's 10. The words followed him long after she left. The house became quiet, too quiet. It always did after midnight. On the mantel sat a framed photograph of Claire, his wife, Noah's mother, gone 4 years now, pancreatic cancer, fast enough to destroy a future before anyone fully understood what was happening. Ethan still remembered everything about her. Her laugh, her voice, the way she always stole the blankets. Noah remembered less every year. That was the part that hurt most. He checked on his son. Noah slept curled on one side of the bed with a worn stuffed dog tucked beneath one arm. Homework finished. School books stacked neatly. 8 years old and already more organized than Ethan had ever been. Standing in the doorway, Ethan felt the familiar combination of pride and guilt that seemed to define fatherhood. He pulled the blanket higher over Noah's shoulder and quietly closed the door. The next morning arrived too quickly. Work consumed the day. Calls, deadlines, mechanical failures. By Friday afternoon, Ethan was buried under enough problems to occupy 3 people. Then Marcus appeared in the doorway carrying an envelope. "This came by courier," Marcus said. Ethan looked up. An actual courier? Uniform and everything. That got his attention. Nobody sent letters anymore. Not important people, not wealthy people, not in 2026. Ethan took the envelope. Heavy paper, silver crest. Expensive enough to announce itself before it was opened. The letterhead read Sterling Automotive Group. Ethan recognized the name immediately. Everyone in the industry did. Sterling Automotive wasn't just successful, it was legendary. Richard Sterling had built it into one of the most respected luxury automotive companies in the country before his death 3 years earlier. Since then, his daughter Victoria Sterling had taken over operations. Ethan unfolded the letter. The wording was brief, direct, almost cold. Sterling Automotive Group seeks to engage an independent engineering consultant for a specialized restoration project. Your name has been recommended by multiple sources whose judgment we trust. If interested, present yourself at the Sterling Estate, 4200 Chestnut Hill Drive, Monday at 10:00 a.m. Ethan read the phrase twice. Present yourself, not, please join us, not, we'd like to meet. Present yourself, like he was being summoned. Marcus lingered near the doorway. "Well," Ethan folded the letter, "find out everything you can about their restoration project." Marcus grinned. Already started. By Sunday evening, the picture was becoming clearer. 7 years earlier, Richard Sterling had begun work on a final automotive masterpiece known internally as Project Halcyon. It was intended to be his legacy vehicle, his final creation before retirement. Then Richard Sterling died. The prototype remained unfinished, or at least that was the public story. The real problem was stranger. The car was complete. Every system appeared functional. Every diagnostic test passed. Yet the vehicle refused to run. Over the years, Sterling Automotive hired engineers, consultants, restoration experts, and even an elite German engineering team. 11 separate groups had attempted to solve the mystery. 11 had failed. What bothered Ethan wasn't that they failed, it was why they failed. Nobody had ever identified a specific fault. Not one. Every report ended the same way. The vehicle should work. But it didn't. On Sunday night, Ethan stood in the backyard watching Noah chase fireflies with a flashlight while thinking about that. Machines didn't simply refuse to function. There was always a reason. Always. The question was whether everyone had been looking in the wrong place. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. Ethan drove his aging pickup through the gates of the Sterling estate and immediately felt underdressed despite wearing his best jacket. The property looked less like a home and more like the headquarters of a small nation. Iron gates, endless driveway, perfect landscaping. The kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself because it assumed everyone already knew. A housekeeper guided him through hallways lined with photographs and into a sitting room overlooking a sprawling garden. Victoria Sterling was waiting. Ethan stepped into the room and stopped. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The house, the estate, the reason he was there. 12 years vanished in an instant. Because he knew her, not as Victoria Sterling, CEO of a billion-dollar company, not as the woman featured in business magazines. He knew her as the 18-year-old engineering student he'd once spent an unforgettable summer with at Georgia Tech. Before her family ended it, before the phone calls stopped, before he learned that some people could close doors you didn't have the power to reopen. Victoria looked up from her coffee, calm, elegant, professional, completely composed. Her eyes settled on him politely and revealed absolutely no sign of recognition. "Mr. Brooks?" she said. Ethan forced himself to move. "Victoria." She extended her hand. "Thank you for coming." The handshake lasted barely a second. To her, he was a stranger. Somehow that hurt more than he expected. Victoria gestured toward a chair. "Please sit." Ethan sat. She remained standing beside the window. "Before we discuss terms," she said, "I want to be direct. Sterling Automotive has hired 11 separate engineering consultants over the last 7 years. Every one of them failed." Ethan listened quietly. "Some of those consultants were considerably more qualified than you are." The statement wasn't insulting, just factual. "Then why am I here?" Victoria studied him. "Because 3 people whose judgment I trust recommended you independently." She set down her coffee. "And because your history suggests you're unusually good at solving problems other people have abandoned." Ethan leaned back slightly. "What do you think is wrong with the vehicle?" For the first time, she hesitated. "I don't know." The honesty surprised him. "I've stopped forming theories," she said. 7 years of wrong answers will do that. Can I see it?" "Not today." Her tone was firm. "Today I need to know whether you're interested." Ethan considered her carefully, then asked the question that had been bothering him since the conversation began. "You don't actually think I'll fix it, do you?" Victoria met his gaze directly. "No." The answer arrived without hesitation. "Then why hire me?" A faint shadow crossed her expression. "Because I've promised myself that before I give up, I will try every reasonable option available." Silence settled between them. "You're the last reasonable option." Most people would have been offended. Ethan wasn't. Instead, he found himself smiling slightly. "I've never taken a job because somebody expected me to fail." Something changed in Victoria's eyes. Just slightly. Not warmth. Not yet. Interest. "Good," she said. "Then perhaps you'll surprise both of us." The meeting ended 30 minutes later. The terms were generous, the access unrestricted, the challenge unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. As he walked back toward his truck, he couldn't stop thinking about 2 things. The first was Project Halcyon. The second was Victoria Sterling, because after 12 years, she still hadn't recognized him, and somehow, he suspected that was about to matter a lot more than either of them realized. Ethan spent the drive home trying very hard not to think about Victoria Sterling. Unfortunately, memory didn't care what he wanted. By the time he reached his driveway, He had already remembered her laugh from 12 years ago, the way she used to tuck her hair behind one ear when concentrating, and the exact moment she'd told him she wanted to design cars that people would remember 50 years after they were built. Some memories fade, others wait quietly until the right person walks back into your life. Noah was sitting at the kitchen table when Ethan walked in. "You're late." Ethan smiled. "I've noticed you're becoming very judgmental. I learned from you." "Fair enough." Ethan tossed his keys onto the counter. Noah immediately looked up from his homework. "How'd the rich people meeting go?" Ethan blinked. "The what?" "The rich people meeting." Noah pointed toward the envelope lying on the counter, the one with the fancy paper. Ethan laughed, despite himself. "You're 8, and? You shouldn't be able to identify expensive stationery." Noah shrugged. "It looked expensive." Ethan sat down across from him. It was interesting. That answer only increased Noah's curiosity. "What kind of project?" Ethan hesitated. "A car." Noah's eyes widened instantly. "A race car?" "No." "Supercar?" "Maybe." "Prototype?" Ethan pointed at him. "You need less internet." Noah grinned. "It's a prototype, isn't it?" Ethan sighed. The kid was entirely too smart. "Maybe." Noah immediately abandoned homework. "Can I see it?" "Absolutely not." "Why?" "Because I haven't seen it yet." Noah looked offended. "They hired you before showing you the car?" Ethan nodded. Noah stared at him. "That's weird." Ethan smiled. "That's exactly what I thought." The following morning, Ethan found himself reading every report Sterling Automotive had provided. Hundreds of pages. Diagnostic summaries, engineering reviews, internal memos, failure analyses. The deeper he dug, the stranger the situation became. Every system checked out. Engine management, fuel delivery, electrical architecture, ignition sequence, security protocols, battery systems, everything worked independently, yet somehow the vehicle never completed startup. The reports all ended the same way. No fault identified. Ethan hated those words. Machines didn't fail without reasons. People simply failed to find them. By noon, he had filled 3 notebooks with observations. By 3 o'clock, he had identified something nobody else seemed interested in. Every report focused on what was wrong with the vehicle. None focused on Richard Sterling himself. That bothered Ethan. Great engineers left fingerprints on their work. Habits, preferences, philosophies. If Project Halcyon was Richard Sterling's final masterpiece, then understanding the man might matter as much as understanding the machine, which led him directly to the company archives. Sterling Automotive's public history contained hundreds of interviews with Richard Sterling. Ethan spent hours reading them. One quote appeared repeatedly. "The best machine isn't the one that impresses people, it's the one that teaches them something." Ethan wrote the sentence down, then circled it twice. Something about it felt important. Late that afternoon, his phone rang. "Victoria." Ethan stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hello. Have you started?" "Straight to business." Some things hadn't changed. A little. Silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, Victoria asked, "Do you think the reports are wrong?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Not exactly." "Then what?" "I think they're incomplete." More silence. "Explain." Ethan smiled slightly. "I haven't earned that answer yet." For the first time, he thought he heard amusement in her voice. Barely. Confident. Careful. "There's a difference?" "Huge difference." Victoria didn't respond immediately. Somewhere in the background, he heard office noise. Meetings. Phones. People. A life moving at full speed. Eventually, she said, "Come to the estate tomorrow morning." "Why?" "Because you're finally going to see the car." The line disconnected before he could ask another question. Wednesday arrived cold and overcast. The Sterling estate somehow looked even larger in daylight. This time, a different employee escorted him through the property. Instead of the main house, they headed toward a separate structure hidden behind rows of trees. The building resembled a museum more than a garage. Glass walls, security systems, climate controls, everything immaculate. Victoria was already waiting when Ethan arrived. "Ready?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the enormous steel doors at the far end of the building. "Depends." "On what?" Whether this thing is worth all the drama, Victoria surprised him by laughing. Not much. Just enough to remind him of the girl he once knew. The sound vanished almost immediately. We'll see. She pressed a button on the wall. The doors began sliding open, slowly, deliberately. Sunlight spilled into the room, and there it was. Project Halcyon. Ethan had spent 2 days preparing himself for disappointment. He failed instantly. The car was extraordinary. Low, elegant, timeless, not futuristic, not aggressive, beautiful, the kind of machine created by someone who cared more about craftsmanship than attention. Polished silver bodywork reflected the overhead lights like liquid metal. Every line served a purpose. Every detail felt intentional. For several seconds, Ethan simply stared. "Wow," he said quietly. Victoria folded her arms. That's usually the first reaction. Ethan walked around the vehicle slowly, not touching it, just observing, looking, listening, the same way he approached every machine. It's not trying to show off. Victoria looked surprised. What? Ethan gestured toward the car. Most prototypes scream for attention. He shook his head. This one doesn't. Silence followed. Then Victoria said something unexpected. My father hated showing off. Ethan stopped walking. Richard Sterling. Not CEO Sterling. Not founder Sterling. Her father. The distinction mattered. He continued circling the vehicle. Every few steps he noticed something unusual. Small details, hidden choices, engineering decisions that seemed strangely personal. Then he reached the driver's side door. Something caught his eye immediately. A tiny engraved symbol hidden beneath the handle, almost invisible. Ethan frowned. What's that? Victoria stepped closer. What? He pointed. She looked. For several seconds neither spoke. I've never noticed that before, she admitted. Ethan stared at the symbol, not because it looked important, because it didn't belong. Every instinct he possessed suddenly woke up. The same instinct that heard timing differences in helicopter startup sequences, the same instinct that solved problems others overlooked. He didn't know why yet. But for the first time since accepting the project, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt before. Not confidence, not certainty. A direction, and somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered the same thought, again and again. The car wasn't broken. It was trying to tell them something. Ethan spent the next hour studying Project Halcyon without touching a single tool. That alone annoyed 3 Sterling engineers assigned to observe him. They stood near a workstation pretending not to watch while secretly tracking every movement he made. Ethan understood the feeling. When a company spent 7 years chasing a mystery, anyone who claimed to have fresh ideas automatically became suspicious. He wasn't offended. He would have felt the same way. Victoria remained nearby for the first 20 minutes before finally asking the question everyone else seemed afraid to ask. What are you doing? Ethan crouched beside the driver's side door. Looking. You've been looking for 20 minutes. Yep, most consultants start testing systems. Ethan glanced up. Most consultants failed. Silence. One of the engineers accidentally laughed. Victoria shot him a look. He immediately became fascinated by a nearby computer monitor. Ethan stood and continued walking around the vehicle. The engraved symbol beneath the door handle bothered him. Not because it was complicated, because it was hidden. Engineers didn't hide things without reasons, especially engineers like Richard Sterling. By now, Ethan had read enough interviews to understand something important. Richard believed machines communicated with people, not literally, philosophically. Every design choice meant something. Every feature served a purpose. Project Halcyon wasn't simply a car. It was a message. The problem was figuring out what the message said. Eventually, Ethan reached the rear of the vehicle. The engine compartment remained partially exposed beneath a glass panel. It was beautiful. Too beautiful. The engineering reminded him of a luxury watch where every component existed in perfect harmony. Has anyone disassembled it completely? He asked. Victoria nodded. Twice. And? Nothing. Ethan smiled faintly. That answer keeps showing up. Victoria folded her arms. Because it's true. Ethan wasn't convinced. Machines always left evidence. If there was truly nothing wrong, then everyone had been asking the wrong question. By noon, he requested access to Richard Sterling's private design records. That request created immediate tension. Several company lawyers became involved. Meetings happened. Permissions were discussed. Ethan spent most of the argument drinking coffee and waiting. Finally, Victoria walked into the archive room carrying a tablet. "You're becoming expensive." Ethan accepted the tablet. "I have that effect on people." Victoria rolled her eyes. "Try not to enjoy it." The records were extensive. Thousands of design notes, sketches, personal observations, development journals. Most consultants had apparently ignored them because they weren't technical documents. Ethan focused on them immediately. 3 hours later, he discovered something interesting. Richard Sterling had a habit. Whenever he solved a difficult engineering problem, he wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the page. Not technical analysis, not specifications. Lessons. One entry read, "The answer is usually standing beside the question." Another said, "Complexity is often fear wearing expensive clothes." Ethan laughed when he read that one. Victoria looked up from across the room. "What's funny?" He showed her the note. To his surprise, she smiled immediately. "That sounds like him." The answer caught him off guard. For a brief moment, she wasn't the CEO of Sterling Automotive. She was simply a daughter remembering her father. Then the expression disappeared. Professional again. Controlled again. Ethan wondered how often that happened. Late in the afternoon, he found something that made him sit up straight. It wasn't a blueprint. It wasn't an engineering report. It was a personal journal entry dated 6 months before Richard Sterling's death. Most of it discussed Project Halcyon, testing schedules, manufacturing delays, performance goals, normal things. Then near the bottom appeared a sentence that made Ethan's pulse quicken. "If they can't find the key, they don't deserve the answer." Ethan read it twice, then a third time. Victoria noticed immediately. "What?" Ethan turned the tablet toward her. She read the line. Silence followed. "What does that mean?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the prototype visible through the archive room window. "I don't know." "Then why do you look excited?" "Because for the first time in 7 years, someone had finally found evidence that the vehicle might not actually be malfunctioning." Ethan leaned back slowly. "Tell me something." Victoria waited. "Did your father enjoy puzzles?" Her expression changed. "He loved them." "Games?" "Constantly." "Challenges?" "Especially impossible ones." Ethan nodded. Everything fit. Every instinct he had been ignoring suddenly aligned. The prototype wasn't acting like a broken machine. It was acting like a locked machine. A deliberate distinction. Victoria stared at him. "You think he did this on purpose?" Ethan looked toward Project Halcyon again. The silver body reflected the fading afternoon light. Calm. Silent. Waiting. Almost patient. "I think," he said carefully, "that 11 engineering teams have spent 7 years trying to repair something that might not need repairing." Complete silence filled the archive room. Even the engineers nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Victoria slowly folded her arms. "And if you're wrong?" Ethan smiled. "Then I'll be consultant number 12. For the first time all day, Victoria laughed openly. It surprised both of them. Then she looked at the prototype again. "And if you're right?" Ethan stood and handed back the tablet. "Then somewhere inside that car is a secret your father never intended engineers to find." Neither of them noticed Douglas Hale standing quietly in the doorway. The 70-year-old engineer had worked beside Richard Sterling for nearly 30 years. He had helped build Project Halcyon from the beginning, and when he heard Ethan's theory, his expression changed completely. Because for the first time in 7 years, someone had finally said the one thing Douglas had secretly wondered all along. Maybe the car wasn't broken. Maybe Richard Sterling had hidden something. And if that was true, Project Halcyon was about to become much more than an engineering mystery. Douglas Hale waited until the engineers left before speaking. The moment the archive room door closed behind them, the older man stepped forward and looked directly at Ethan. "Richard would have liked you." The statement came out of nowhere. Ethan blinked. "That's a strange thing to say." Douglas shrugged. "It's true." At 70 years old, Douglas had reached the stage of life where he no longer cared whether people found him unusual. 30 years at Sterling Automotive had given him a permanent dislike for meetings and a permanent appreciation for blunt honesty. Victoria looked between them. "You knew my father better than anyone." Douglas nodded. "Probably." Then he pointed toward the journal entry still displayed on the tablet. "And Ethan's right." Silence filled the room. Victoria stared at him. "You think Project Halcyon was intentionally locked?" Douglas looked toward the prototype through the glass. For a moment, he seemed decades younger. Not because his appearance changed, because his memories did. "I've thought about it for years." Ethan immediately paid attention. "Why didn't you say anything?" Douglas laughed softly. "Because I had no evidence." He walked toward the window, overlooking the vehicle. "Richard and I worked together almost every day for 3 decades. He was many things. Stubborn, brilliant, occasionally impossible." Victoria smiled despite herself. "Accurate." Douglas nodded. "But one thing he wasn't." He tapped the glass lightly, was careless. The room grew quiet again. If Richard wanted that car running, it would have been running. Ethan felt something click. Not an answer. A direction. Again. Douglas continued. 3 months before he died, he stopped discussing the engineering problems. Victoria frowned. "What does that mean?" "Exactly what it sounds like." Douglas folded his arms. Every conversation shifted. Shifted to what? Douglas looked at her carefully. "You." The word landed heavily. Victoria didn't respond. Douglas rarely spoke emotionally. Which meant, when he did, people listened. "He worried about you." Victoria looked away. "He worried about the company." "No." Douglas shook his head. "He worried about you." Silence followed. Ethan said nothing. Some conversations belonged to other people. Douglas sighed. The company was fine. The money was fine. The technology was fine. Another pause. "You weren't." Victoria stared at him. "That's not fair." "Maybe not." Douglas's voice softened. But it was true. The room suddenly felt smaller. Ethan found himself studying old photographs hanging on the archive wall. Richard Sterling standing beside concept vehicles. Richard shaking hands with engineers. Richard smiling. In every picture he looked proud, yet somehow tired, like a man carrying something heavy. Douglas walked toward one of the shelves and pulled out a thin binder covered in dust. "I almost forgot this existed." He handed it to Ethan. The cover read, "Halcyon Development Notes." Ethan opened it carefully. Most pages contained sketches, observations, design revisions. Then something unusual appeared near the back. A list. Not technical specifications. Names, dozens of names. Engineers, designers, fabricators, suppliers. Every person involved in the project. Ethan turned another page. More names, then another. Finally, near the end, only one name remained. Victoria Sterling. The page beneath it was blank. Ethan looked up slowly. Douglas nodded. "Exactly." Victoria stepped closer. "What?" Ethan turned the binder toward her. "Your father ended the list with you." Silence. She stared at the page. "Maybe that means nothing." Douglas laughed quietly. Richard Sterling never did anything that meant nothing. Nobody argued with that. Ethan flipped through the remaining pages. Most were empty. Then something caught his eye. A folded corner. Small. Deliberate. Hidden. He unfolded it carefully. A handwritten note appeared beneath. 4 words. "Look where she won't." Complete silence. Victoria stared. Douglas stared. Ethan stared. "Well," Ethan said finally, "that's not normal." Douglas actually laughed. "Welcome to Richard Sterling." Ethan read the sentence again. "Look where she won't." Not where she can't, where she won't. The distinction mattered. Victoria folded her arms tightly. "You think he's talking about me? I think he literally wrote your name 3 pages earlier." Ethan smiled faintly. "So yes." Victoria didn't look amused. "That's ridiculous." Douglas shook his head. "No, it's personal." Ethan closed the binder. For the first time since arriving at Sterling Estate, he felt certain of something. Project Halcyon wasn't a machine problem. It was a message. Richard Sterling hadn't hidden a malfunction. He had hidden a journey. Every clue pointed toward the same destination. Victoria. Which raised a more troubling question. Why? The answer arrived unexpectedly 2 hours later. Ethan was examining interior photographs of the prototype when he noticed something odd. Every documented inspection avoided one specific area. Not intentionally, accidentally. Human nature. People focused on the engine, electronics, power systems. Nobody spent much time looking beneath the passenger side rear compartment. It was too small to matter, too inconvenient to access, too ordinary. Ethan stared at the images, then remembered the note. "Look where she won't." A slow smile appeared. Victoria noticed immediately. "What?" Ethan stood. "I need to see the car. Now? Now." 20 minutes later, they were back inside the prototype facility. Evening sunlight stretched across the polished floor. Project Halcyon sat exactly where they left it, silent, waiting. Ethan walked directly to the passenger side and crouched near the rear interior panel. Victoria watched skeptically. Douglas watched with growing interest. Ethan removed a flashlight from his toolkit and inspected the compartment carefully. Nothing, at least at first. Then he saw it. A seam, barely visible, hidden behind a section of handcrafted leather trim. Most people would have missed it. 11 engineering teams apparently had. Ethan smiled. "Found you." Victoria stepped forward. "Found what?" Ethan looked up. A compartment. Silence exploded through the room. Douglas's eyes widened. Victoria froze. Ethan carefully pressed against the trim. A soft click echoed through the cabin. Then a concealed panel opened. Slowly, deliberately, as though it hadn't moved in years. Inside sat a single object. An envelope. Yellowed with age. Sealed. Waiting. Across the front, written in Richard Sterling's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 simple words. "For my daughter, Victoria." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. 7 years of mystery. 7 years of engineering failures. 7 years of questions. And hidden inside the prototype the entire time was a letter. Ethan looked at Victoria. She looked at the envelope. For the first time since he'd seen her again, all traces of the confident CEO disappeared. In her place stood a daughter staring at a message from a father she'd lost. And somehow Ethan knew that whatever happened next was going to matter far more than whether the car ever started. For several seconds, nobody touched the envelope. The prototype facility had never felt quieter. Outside, the sun continued sinking behind the trees surrounding the estate, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Inside, 3 people stared at a letter that had remained hidden for 7 years. Ethan stepped back first. This wasn't his moment. It never had been. Victoria remained frozen beside the open compartment, her eyes fixed on her father's handwriting. "For my daughter, Victoria." 5 words. That was all. Yet somehow they carried more weight than every engineering report stacked in the archives. Douglas quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I haven't seen his handwriting in years." Victoria swallowed hard, then carefully reached into the compartment and lifted out the envelope. Her hands trembled slightly, just enough for Ethan to notice. The CEO of a billion-dollar company, the woman who negotiated mergers worth hundreds of millions without blinking, reduced to silence by an envelope. Some things were bigger than business. The seal opened with a soft crackle. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Victoria unfolded several pages. For a moment she simply stared. Then she began reading. Her expression changed almost immediately. Not dramatically, gradually. Surprise, confusion, sadness, then something deeper. Ethan looked away. Reading private grief felt wrong. Several minutes passed before Victoria finally spoke. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "He knew." Douglas frowned. "Knew what?" She looked down at the letter again. "Everything." Silence followed. "The doctors told him 6 months before anyone else." Douglas's face fell. Ethan remained still. Victoria continued reading. "He knew he wasn't going to finish the project." Her voice cracked slightly. "And he knew I was angry with him." Nobody interrupted. Some truths needed room to breathe. Eventually, Victoria handed the letter to Douglas. The older engineer read silently. Halfway through, he closed his eyes. Ethan had never seen someone look simultaneously heartbroken and relieved. Finally, Douglas handed the pages back. You should keep that. Victoria nodded. But she didn't move. Ethan could see something happening behind her eyes. Years of unresolved questions rearranging themselves into new shapes. What did it say? He asked gently. Victoria looked toward Project Halcyon. The car was never supposed to be his legacy. Ethan frowned. Then what was? Her answer came quietly. I was. Silence settled across the room again. The words lingered. Douglas laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because Richard Sterling would absolutely have hidden an emotional confession inside a prototype that baffled engineers for 7 years. It was exactly the sort of thing he would do. Ethan looked toward the open compartment. There's more. Victoria blinked. What? Ethan pointed inside. Tucked beneath where the envelope had rested sat a second object. Smaller. Metal. Douglas leaned closer. That's not a component. Ethan carefully removed it. A brass key. Old-fashioned, heavy, completely out of place inside a modern automotive prototype. Victoria stared at it. What is that? Ethan smiled slightly. That's what I'd like to know. Attached to the key was a tiny tag, more handwriting. Richard Sterling again. This time only 3 words. Not the first. Douglas read them twice. What does that mean? Ethan turned the key over in his hand. It means this isn't the key we're looking for. Victoria groaned softly. Of course it isn't. Ethan laughed. Your father liked puzzles. I'm beginning to hate puzzles. That earned the first genuine smile she'd shown all day. For the next hour they searched every remaining compartment in the prototype. Nothing. No hidden panels. No additional letters. No secret switches. Eventually Douglas leaned against a workbench and sighed. We're missing something. Ethan nodded. Definitely. The key wasn't random. The note wasn't random. Nothing Richard Sterling did was random. The challenge was understanding the sequence. Victoria sat inside the prototype's passenger seat, reading the letter again. Then a sentence caught her attention. She froze. Ethan noticed immediately. What? Victoria looked up slowly. He mentions my mother. Douglas straightened. What about her? Victoria scanned the page. She promised she'd keep it safe until you were ready. Silence. Ethan's eyes widened first, then Douglas's. Keep what safe? Douglas asked. Victoria looked down at the brass key in Ethan's hand. Suddenly everyone reached the same conclusion at exactly the same time. The real key. Her mother had it. Ethan leaned back against the vehicle and laughed softly. 7 years, 11 engineering teams, countless diagnostics, and somehow the solution had never been inside the car at all. It had been sitting with Victoria's mother the entire time. Victoria stood abruptly. I'm calling her. Douglas smiled. Good luck. She frowned. What does that mean? Douglas folded his arms. It means Eleanor Sterling has ignored half my phone calls since 2018. Ethan couldn't help laughing. Victoria rolled her eyes and pulled out her phone. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. When she ended it, her expression looked somewhere between shock and disbelief. Well? Ethan asked. Victoria stared at him. She wasn't surprised. Silence. Not even a little. Douglas burst out laughing. That's Richard. Victoria shook her head slowly. She said she'd been waiting. Waiting for what? Ethan asked. Victoria looked toward Project Halcyon, then toward the letter in her hands, then finally toward the brass key, waiting for someone smart enough to stop fixing the car and start listening to it. Ethan smiled. Somehow that answer felt familiar. Machines tell the truth. The challenge was learning how to listen. Tomorrow they would visit Eleanor Sterling. Tomorrow they might finally find the missing piece. Tomorrow Project Halcyon might reveal the secret it had protected for 7 years. But as Ethan watched Victoria carefully fold her father's letter and place it back inside the envelope, he realized something important. The real mystery was already being solved. Not the one inside the car, the one inside Victoria. Because for the first time since he'd seen her again, she wasn't acting like a CEO trying to save a project. She was acting like a daughter finding her way back to a father she thought she'd lost forever. The drive to Eleanor Sterling's house took just under an hour. Nobody spoke much during the trip. Victoria drove. Ethan sat in the passenger seat. The brass key rested inside a small leather pouch between them. Douglas followed in a separate vehicle behind. Outside, Autumn sunlight filtered through rows of oak trees lining the country roads. Inside the car, tension slowly built. Not because anyone expected bad news, because they expected answers, and answers had a way of changing things. Eleanor Sterling lived in a white farmhouse overlooking a lake about 30 miles from the city. The property couldn't have been more different from the Sterling estate. No gates, no security checkpoints, no sprawling mansion. Just a peaceful home surrounded by gardens and old trees. When Victoria parked, an elderly woman was already waiting on the porch. She looked remarkably calm for someone whose daughter was arriving to discuss a 7-year corporate mystery. "Hello, sweetheart," Eleanor said as Victoria stepped out of the car. Then she noticed Ethan. For a brief moment, her expression changed. Not surprise, recognition. The kind people show when a missing puzzle piece suddenly appears. Ethan immediately noticed. So did she. "Interesting," Eleanor said softly. Victoria frowned. "What?" Eleanor smiled. "Nothing," which usually meant something. A few minutes later, everyone sat around a wooden kitchen table. Fresh coffee appeared, homemade cookies appeared. Ethan suspected refusing either would have been impossible. Eventually, Victoria placed the leather pouch on the table. "Mom," Eleanor nodded. "The key?" Victoria blinked. "You knew?" Eleanor laughed. "Of course I knew." Douglas buried his face in one hand. "I knew it." Eleanor pointed at him. "You always overcomplicated things." Ethan smiled. He was beginning to understand where Victoria inherited certain traits. Victoria slid the brass key across the table. "Dad left this in the car." Eleanor examined it briefly before nodding. "Good. Good?" Victoria stared. "Mom, people spent 7 years trying to solve this." Eleanor looked completely unimpressed. "Your father expected that." Silence. Ethan leaned forward. "Expected it?" Eleanor nodded. "Richard used to complain that engineers only trusted machines." Another sip of coffee. "He thought people should be studied just as carefully." Ethan laughed softly. That sounded exactly like the man whose journals he'd been reading. Victoria folded her arms. "So, where's the real key?" Eleanor smiled. "Upstairs." Nobody moved. Then she stood. "Well?" The group followed her through the house and into a small study overlooking the lake. The room looked untouched. Bookshelves lined every wall. Photographs filled every available surface. Richard Sterling seemed to exist everywhere. Younger, older, building prototypes, standing beside race cars, smiling beside his family. Eleanor walked directly toward a grandfather clock in the corner. Not a safe, not a vault, a clock. She opened a small compartment, hidden inside the wooden case, then removed a narrow metal box. Victoria stared. "You've had that the entire time?" Eleanor nodded. "Your father asked me to keep it." Ethan exchanged a look with Douglas. 7 years, 11 engineering teams, millions of dollars, and the answer had been sitting inside a clock. Eleanor handed the box to Victoria. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Victoria carefully opened it. Inside rested a second key, smaller, silver, modern. Attached to it was another handwritten note. Victoria unfolded it slowly. Richard's handwriting appeared once again. "If Ethan is with you, trust him." Complete silence filled the study. Ethan froze. Douglas froze. Victoria stared at the note, then read it again. Ethan felt his heartbeat suddenly accelerate. "What?" Victoria whispered. Eleanor smiled softly, not surprised at all. Ethan looked up. "How does he know my name?" Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Eleanor sat down beside the window. "Because Richard knew about you." The room became very still. Victoria looked confused. "About Ethan?" Eleanor nodded. "Years ago." More silence. "Long before either of you walked back into each other's lives." Victoria turned toward Ethan. Ethan looked equally lost. Eleanor continued. "Richard found your college journals after you came home from Georgia Tech." Victoria's eyes widened. "My journals?" "The ones where you wrote about a young engineering student named Ethan Brooks." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Eleanor smiled gently. "You weren't exactly subtle." Victoria looked horrified. Ethan looked like he wanted the floor to open beneath him. Douglas looked delighted. "This keeps getting better." Victoria ignored him completely. Dad knew? Eleanor nodded. Everything. Another pause. He read about the boy who challenged your design calculations. Ethan groaned quietly. Victoria looked at him. You did challenge my calculations. You were wrong. I was not. You absolutely were. Douglas laughed so hard he nearly fell into a chair. Eleanor smiled. See? Then her expression softened. Richard always hoped you'd find each other again. Silence followed, the kind of silence that changes a room. Victoria looked down at the note in her hand. If Ethan is with you, trust him. Suddenly, the message wasn't about engineering anymore. It wasn't about the prototype. It wasn't even about the keys. Richard Sterling had spent 7 years creating a puzzle designed to bring his daughter back to something she lost, or someone. Ethan wasn't sure which possibility frightened him more. Eleanor stood and gently closed the metal box. The final answer is inside the car. Victoria looked up. You're sure? Eleanor smiled. Richard never liked unfinished stories. An hour later, they returned to the Sterling estate carrying both keys. The prototype facility waited exactly as they left it. Project Halcyon sat beneath the lights, silent and beautiful. Waiting. Ethan stood beside the driver's door holding the silver key. Every clue, every note, every hidden message had led to this moment. Victoria stood opposite him. Douglas watched nearby. Nobody spoke. Slowly, Ethan inserted the key into a concealed slot hidden beneath the dashboard. There was a soft click. Then another. Somewhere deep inside the vehicle, mechanisms began moving for the first time in 7 years, and suddenly Project Halcyon came alive. For one breathtaking second, nothing happened. Then the prototype woke up. Soft lights illuminated across the dashboard. Hidden displays emerged silently from the handcrafted interior. A low electronic tone echoed through the cabin as dormant systems began communicating for the first time in 7 years. Victoria stared. Douglas stared. Ethan simply listened. Machines always spoke before they moved. Most people just didn't know how to hear them. The startup sequence continued. Power systems initialized. Internal diagnostics ran automatically. Hidden modules came online one by one. Green indicators appeared across the instrument cluster. Every system reported healthy. Every system reported ready. Then the sequence stopped. Silence returned. Victoria's face fell immediately. No. Ethan didn't react. Douglas stepped closer. What happened? The dashboard remained illuminated. The car remained powered, but the engine never started. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Ethan smiled. Victoria looked at him as though he had lost his mind. Why are you smiling? Ethan pointed toward the dashboard. Because this is the first honest thing the car has done. Silence. What does that mean? Victoria asked. Ethan leaned into the driver's compartment. It means the car isn't fighting us anymore. He tapped one of the displays. It's talking to us. Across the center screen, a message slowly appeared. White text against a black background. Welcome back. Nobody spoke. Another line appeared beneath it. If you are reading this, you finally learned to stop looking for broken parts. Douglas laughed first. A deep, exhausted laugh. Richard, you impossible old man. Victoria covered her mouth. Ethan couldn't help smiling. The message continued. Some things aren't meant to be repaired. Some things are meant to be understood. More text followed. Each key opens a different part of the story. The final step belongs to Victoria. The screen went dark. Then a small compartment beneath the steering wheel unlocked with a soft click. Victoria stared at it. Another compartment? Douglas groaned dramatically. Of course, there's another compartment. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside rested a small leather journal. Nothing else. No electronics. No secret control module. Just a journal. Victoria lifted it out slowly. The cover carried a familiar imprint. R.S. Richard Sterling's initials. She opened the first page. For a moment she couldn't speak. The handwriting was unmistakable. Personal. Private. Not engineering notes. Not company records. A father talking to his daughter. Ethan stepped back automatically. Douglas did the same. This wasn't for them. Victoria turned pages quietly, occasionally stopping, occasionally smiling. Occasionally wiping away tears, she pretended nobody noticed. Nearly 20 minutes passed before she finally looked up. He was scared. Douglas frowned. Of what? Victoria closed the journal gently. That he spent too much time building companies and not enough time building relationships. Silence followed. He thought I'd become like him. Nobody responded. Because everyone understood. Victoria looked down again. He wasn't trying to leave me a car. Her voice softened. He was trying to leave me a warning. Ethan felt something settle into place. The prototype was never a legacy project. It was an apology, hidden inside engineering because engineering was the language Richard Sterling knew best. Suddenly another folded page slipped from the journal and landed on the floor. Ethan picked it up carefully. A photograph, old, slightly faded. The moment Victoria saw it, she froze. Ethan froze too. The picture had been taken 12 years earlier. 2 college students standing beside a prototype solar vehicle at a university competition. One of them was Victoria. The other was Ethan. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Douglas looked from one face to the other and immediately understood. Well, he folded his arms. That explains a lot. Victoria stared at the photograph, then at Ethan, then back at the photograph. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. No. Ethan smiled weakly. Probably. No. She stepped closer. Georgia Tech? Ethan nodded. Summer engineering program. Victoria's eyes widened. You built the suspension redesign. You redesigned it 3 days later because you hated my version. Douglas looked delighted. Please continue. Neither paid attention to him. Victoria stared. Ethan Brooks. Victoria Sterling. Silence stretched between them. Then suddenly she laughed. Not politely, not professionally, genuinely. I can't believe I didn't recognize you. Ethan shrugged. It's been 12 years. You had longer hair. You carried 3 notebooks everywhere. I still carry notebooks. That's concerning. She laughed again. This time neither of them looked away. Douglas quietly moved toward the far side of the facility. Some moments deserved privacy. For several minutes, Ethan and Victoria talked about things neither had mentioned in years. Professors, competitions, late-night design arguments, small memories that somehow survived more than a decade. It felt strangely natural, as though the missing years had folded inward. Eventually, Victoria glanced down at the photograph again. Dad knew. Ethan nodded slowly. Looks that way. How? Ethan smiled. Apparently you wrote about me. Victoria immediately looked horrified. Ethan laughed. Your mother told us. She covered her face with both hands. I'm never speaking to her again. You absolutely are. Probably. They stood beside Project Halcyon in comfortable silence. Then the dashboard suddenly chimed. All 3 turned. A final message appeared on the center display. One last step. Douglas sighed dramatically. Of course there is. Beneath the words appeared a set of coordinates. Ethan stared at them. Victoria stared too. Then recognition flashed across her face. The lake house. Ethan looked toward her. Your mother's place? Victoria nodded. The boathouse. Silence. Dad built it himself. Douglas laughed softly. Ladies and gentlemen, he pointed toward the display. The man really hid the final clue at a second location. Victoria shook her head. Unbelievable. Ethan smiled. Actually. He looked at Project Halcyon. Then the journal. Then the photograph still resting in Victoria's hand. It's exactly what I would have expected. Because by now, they finally understood the truth. Richard Sterling wasn't testing engineers. He wasn't protecting a prototype. He was guiding his daughter through one final journey. And somehow, that journey wasn't finished yet. The drive back to the lake house happened in near silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that follows a revelation large enough to rearrange old memories. Victoria sat behind the wheel, staring at the road ahead, while Ethan occupied the passenger seat beside her. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she was still trying to process the fact that Ethan Brooks wasn't just a consultant. He wasn't just the engineer who solved Project Halcyon. He was the boy she had fallen in love with when she was 18. The realization felt absurd. 12 years. Hundreds of meetings. Dozens of conversations. And she hadn't recognized him. Finally, she glanced sideways. You should have told me. Ethan smiled without looking up from the journal resting in his lap. Would it have mattered? Victoria frowned. Of course it would have mattered. How? Silence followed. She hated the question because she wasn't sure she had an answer. Ethan looked out the window. You didn't recognize me. 12 years is a long time. Exactly. Victoria sighed. Somehow every argument with Ethan felt less like a debate and more like a mirror, annoyingly accurate. 20 minutes later they arrived at Eleanor Sterling's property again. This time they bypassed the house entirely and headed toward the old boathouse sitting near the edge of the lake. The structure looked ancient compared to the immaculate Sterling estate, weathered wood, faded paint. Years of memories hidden inside every board. Douglas arrived a few minutes later and joined them at the entrance. Tell me we're almost done. Ethan laughed. You sound tired. I'm 70. Douglas pointed toward the boathouse. I've earned it. Victoria opened the door. Dust danced through shafts of sunlight streaming between wooden beams. Old fishing equipment lined the walls. Tools hung from racks. A small workbench occupied the far corner. Everything appeared ordinary, which immediately made Ethan suspicious. Richard Sterling never hid important things in obvious places. For the next 30 minutes they searched methodically. Shelves, cabinets, storage compartments, floor panels, nothing. Eventually Douglas sat down on an overturned crate. Maybe the old man finally beat us. Victoria crossed her arms. No. Ethan noticed something in her voice. Confidence. Not hope, confidence. Why? He asked. Victoria looked around the room. Because Dad always finished what he started. Silence followed. Then Ethan's eyes drifted toward the workbench. Something felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Slightly wrong. The same feeling he'd experienced beside the helicopter, beside Project Halcyon, beside every machine that tried to tell him something. Slowly he walked closer. The workbench itself wasn't unusual. The objects on top weren't unusual. The photograph resting in the corner was. Ethan picked it up carefully. A younger Richard Sterling stood beside a teenage Victoria. They were smiling, building something together. A small wooden boat. Ethan turned the frame over. 4 words were written on the back. Start where we began. Victoria froze. Oh, Douglas groaned. Another clue. But Victoria wasn't listening anymore. She moved directly toward the far wall. Ethan followed. There, hanging above an old storage cabinet, rested the first wooden paddle she and her father had ever built together. The paint had faded. Time had worn its surface smooth, yet she recognized it instantly. Her fingers brushed the handle gently, then stopped. There's something here. Ethan stepped closer. Hidden beneath layers of varnish was a tiny brass plate. Almost invisible. Victoria pressed against it. A click echoed through the boathouse. Everyone froze. Somewhere beneath the floor, a mechanism released. Douglas laughed so hard he nearly fell off the crate. You've got to be kidding me. A section of floor slowly lifted near the center of the room. Beneath it sat a small waterproof chest. Nobody moved immediately. 7 years of clues had taught them patience. Finally, Victoria knelt and opened the chest. Inside rested a single object. A leather portfolio. No locks, no puzzles, no hidden compartments. Just a portfolio. Ethan watched as she opened it. Architectural drawings, engineering sketches, personal notes, hundreds of pages, the complete Project Halcyon design archive. But that wasn't what captured their attention. Tucked inside the front cover was one final letter. Richard Sterling's handwriting appeared across the top. If you found this, you finally understood the point. Victoria sat down heavily on the floor. Ethan and Douglas remained quiet. She began reading. The letter wasn't about the car. It wasn't about Sterling Automotive. It wasn't about engineering. It was about regret. Richard wrote about years spent chasing success while convincing himself he was doing it for his family. He wrote about missed birthdays, missed vacations, missed opportunities. He wrote about discovering too late that providing for people wasn't the same thing as being present for them. Then came the final paragraph. Victoria read it aloud without realizing she was doing so. The car was never my legacy. You were. The company was never my greatest achievement. You were. If this journey taught you anything, I hope it taught you what took me too long to learn. The people you love matter more than the things you build. Always. Silence filled the boathouse. Nobody spoke for a long time. Finally, Douglas cleared his throat. Well, his voice sounded suspiciously emotional. That old idiot managed to make me cry one last time. Victoria laughed through tears. Ethan smiled quietly. Then something slipped from the back of the portfolio. Another photograph. This one newer. Richard Sterling standing beside Eleanor, smiling, happy. On the back, one final handwritten note appeared. Victoria read it slowly, then looked up at Ethan. What? He asked. She handed him the photo. The note contained only one sentence. Some things deserve a second chance. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Douglas immediately stood up. Well? He dusted off his jacket. I'm suddenly remembering several important appointments somewhere else. Victoria laughed. Ethan shook his head. Within moments, Douglas was halfway out the door. The old engineer wasn't subtle, never had been. Soon only Ethan and Victoria remained inside the quiet boathouse. Sunlight reflected off the lake outside. Wind moved gently through the trees. For the first time since they met again, there were no clues left to solve. No puzzles left to chase. No mysteries left to uncover, just two people standing in the space between who they used to be and who they might become, and neither of them realized that Project Halcyon's greatest gift had never been hidden inside the car. It had been hidden inside them all along. The ride back from the lake house felt different, not because the mystery was solved, because there was no mystery left to hide behind. For nearly a week, Ethan and Victoria had been chasing clues, decoding messages, opening compartments, and following a trail Richard Sterling designed years before his death. Every conversation had a purpose. Every meeting had an objective. Every moment carried the safety of a problem that needed solving. Now the problem was gone, which left something far more complicated, the truth. Victoria drove in silence for several miles before finally speaking. You know what's strange? Ethan looked out the passenger window toward the fading afternoon sunlight. Probably a lot of things. She laughed softly. Fair. Then she glanced toward him. When I was 18, I thought I knew exactly how my life would turn out. Ethan smiled. Dangerous mistake. Tell me about it. Silence returned briefly. I was supposed to build cars, she shrugged. Travel the world. Become successful. Ethan nodded. You did all of those things. Yeah. Her voice softened, but somehow the picture still ended up different. Ethan understood. Most adults did. The life people imagined at 18 rarely survived reality intact. Victoria glanced toward him again. What about you? Ethan thought about the question, then smiled faintly. At 18, I thought I'd work for a major engineering company forever. Apex. Apex. Victoria laughed. You were obsessed. I was not. You absolutely were. Ethan couldn't argue. She was right. Then life happened. Victoria's expression softened. Claire. Ethan nodded. For a moment neither spoke. Then Victoria surprised him. I wish I'd met her. The answer hit harder than he expected. Ethan stared ahead through the windshield. You would have liked her. Yeah? She would have liked you too. Victoria smiled sadly. That's generous. Ethan shook his head. It's true. Silence followed. Comfortable. Honest. Different from before. When they finally arrived back at the Sterling estate, the sun was beginning to set. Golden light stretched across the property. Project Halcyon waited inside its glass facility, exactly where they left it. Yet somehow it felt different now. Less like a mystery. More like a memory. Victoria stopped near the entrance. Neither immediately got out of the car. Finally she looked toward him. Thank you, Ethan frowned. For what? She laughed. Seriously? He shrugged. Victoria shook her head. For finding the letter. For figuring out what nobody else could. Then her voice softened. For helping me understand my father. Ethan sat quietly for a moment, then smiled. I didn't do that. You absolutely did. No, he pointed toward the estate behind them. Your father did. Victoria stared at him, then laughed softly. Because once again he had redirected the credit somewhere else. It was infuriating. And somehow one of the things she liked most about him. The next morning brought a new challenge. Noah, Ethan arrived home later than usual. The moment he stepped through the front door, he found his son sitting at the kitchen table waiting. That alone was suspicious. Noah usually attacked dinner immediately. "Uh-oh," Ethan said. Noah folded his arms. "You went somewhere." Ethan blinked. "That's your opening question?" "It's an observation." Ethan groaned. "I've created a monster." Noah ignored him. "You've been smiling all week." Ethan froze. "I have not." "You have." Noah nodded confidently. "Mrs. Pet noticed too." Ethan suddenly considered moving to another state. Unfortunately, Noah wasn't finished. "Is it because of the car?" Ethan sat down slowly. "Partly." "Or because of Victoria?" Silence. Complete silence. Noah grinned. Ethan stared. "You're 8, and this conversation shouldn't be." He could practically hear it. Noah leaned forward. "I like her." Ethan looked up. "You've met her once." "Still counts." "Fair point." The following afternoon, Victoria arrived unexpectedly at Ethan's workshop. Not the estate. Not a conference room. His actual workshop. The place where machines leaked oil, coffee mugs accumulated everywhere, and organization existed mostly as a theoretical concept. Marcus nearly walked into a toolbox when he realized who had entered the building. Victoria looked around with obvious amusement. "This is chaos." Ethan glanced around. "It's organized chaos." "That's not a thing." "It absolutely is." She laughed, then noticed something sitting on his workbench. A small model car, half-finished, handmade. Victoria picked it up carefully. "What's this?" Ethan smiled. "Noah and I build one every year." Her expression softened. "Every year?" Ethan nodded. "Started after Claire died." Silence followed. "Why?" He thought about it for a second. "Because I needed something that belonged to us." Victoria looked at the model car. Then at him. Then at the workshop around them. For the first time, she realized something important. Ethan never stopped building things. He simply changed what he was building. Years ago, it was aerospace systems, then businesses, then a life for his son. Somehow all of it mattered. Before either could say anything else, Marcus appeared in the doorway. "Sorry to interrupt." Ethan immediately recognized the look on his face. "What happened?" Marcus smiled. "You might want to see this." 20 minutes later, Ethan and Victoria stood inside the Project Halcyon facility again. The prototype sat beneath the lights. Silent. Waiting. Douglas stood nearby wearing an expression that suggested he was trying very hard not to smile. Victoria frowned. "What's going on?" Douglas pointed toward the dashboard. "Look." Ethan stepped closer. A message had appeared on the central display, one they hadn't seen before. Apparently, activating the system with both keys unlocked additional programming. The words glowed softly against the dark screen. "If you made it this far, you're ready." Beneath the message appeared a single illuminated button. "Start engine." Silence filled the room. Nobody moved. 7 years. 11 engineering teams. Hundreds of failed attempts. And now, for the first time, Project Halcyon was finally asking permission. Ethan looked toward Victoria. Victoria looked toward the car. Somewhere deep inside the prototype, Richard Sterling's final masterpiece was waiting to come alive. And neither of them knew that when the engine finally started, it would change far more than the future of a car. Nobody moved. The illuminated Start Engine button glowed softly in the center of Project Halcyon's dashboard, like it had been waiting for this exact moment. In a way, it had. 7 years of silence. 7 years of failed diagnostics, abandoned theories, engineering reports, consultant evaluations, and unanswered questions had all led here. Ethan stood beside the driver's door. Victoria stood opposite him. Douglas watched from several feet away with his arms folded and an expression somewhere between anticipation and disbelief. Finally, Douglas cleared his throat. "Well?" Nobody responded. "I've waited 7 years for this," he continued. "Somebody push the button before I die of old age." That earned nervous laughter. Even Victoria smiled. Then the room became quiet again. Ethan looked toward her. "It's your father's car." Victoria stared at the display. No. Ethan frowned. No? She shook her head slowly. It was never his car. Silence followed. Then she smiled faintly. That was the entire point. Ethan understood immediately. Project Halcyon had never been about ownership. It had been about understanding, about connection, about learning what Richard Sterling spent years trying to say. Victoria stepped forward and slid into the driver's seat. For a brief moment, she rested her hand on the steering wheel, the same wheel her father had designed, the same cockpit he had spent years perfecting, the same machine he had transformed into one final conversation. She closed her eyes, then pressed the button. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the prototype inhaled. A low electronic hum echoed through the chassis. Power surged through systems that had slept for nearly a decade. Displays illuminated completely. Interior lighting activated. Hidden gauges awakened. Somewhere beneath the silver bodywork, motors engaged. Pumps cycled. Control systems synchronized. Ethan listened carefully. Every sound felt deliberate, purposeful, alive. Then the engine started. Not violently, not dramatically, elegantly. The sound filled the facility like music, deep, refined, confident. Every engineer in the room froze. Douglas closed his eyes immediately. Victoria gripped the steering wheel. Ethan smiled. 7 years. The engine settled into a smooth idle as though it had been running yesterday. Not a single warning light appeared. Not a single fault code registered. Project Halcyon wasn't broken. It never had been. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Douglas laughed, a loud, emotional laugh that echoed through the facility. You stubborn old genius. Victoria looked down at the dashboard. Tears filled her eyes before she realized they were there. The center display illuminated once more. One final message appeared. Thank you for finishing the journey. Then another line appeared beneath it. Now go make memories. Silence swallowed the room. Even Ethan felt it, the weight of an ending, and a beginning. Victoria reached up and gently touched the screen. Goodbye, Dad. Nobody interrupted. Some moments belonged entirely to the people living them. Eventually, Douglas cleared his throat again, this time more softly. Well, he smiled. What happens now? Victoria looked toward Ethan, then toward the prototype, then back toward Ethan again. Now, she laughed quietly, I think we drive it. 30 minutes later, Project Halcyon rolled out of the facility under its own power for the first time in 7 years. Employees emerged from offices. Engineers left workshops. Security guards abandoned their stations. Word spread across the estate faster than wildfire. By the time the silver prototype reached the main driveway, dozens of people had gathered to watch. Nobody cheered immediately. They simply stared. Some had worked on the project for years. Some had spent entire careers at Sterling Automotive. Many believed they would never see this day. Victoria sat behind the wheel. Ethan occupied the passenger seat. Douglas claimed the rear seat before anyone else could. I've earned this, he informed them. Nobody argued. The prototype glided down the estate roads smoothly, effortlessly. Every system performed perfectly. Every gauge remained stable. Every component behaved exactly as Richard Sterling intended. For several miles, nobody spoke. Then Douglas laughed again. You realize something? Ethan glanced back. What's that? Douglas pointed toward the dashboard. The car was never testing engineers. Ethan nodded. No, it was testing people. Silence followed. Victoria smiled. Dad would have loved that. They drove until sunset painted the horizon gold. Then they turned back toward the estate, back toward home, back toward whatever came next. That evening, after the celebrations ended and the estate finally grew quiet, Ethan returned home exhausted. Noah was waiting. Of course he was. The moment Ethan walked through the front door, the boy jumped off the couch. Well? Ethan blinked. Well, what? Noah stared. The car. Fair point. Ethan laughed and sat beside him. It started. Noah's eyes widened. Seriously? Seriously. After 7 years? After 7 years? Noah pumped a fist into the air. Yes. Ethan couldn't help smiling. The enthusiasm was contagious. Then Noah tilted his head suspiciously. And? Ethan froze. And what? Noah folded his arms. That's not your happy face. Ethan groaned immediately. I have different happy faces? Obviously. The kid was impossible. Noah grinned. This is about Victoria again. Ethan looked toward the ceiling. Somewhere, Claire was definitely enjoying this. You know, Noah continued thoughtfully, for an engineer, you're really bad at hiding things. Ethan laughed despite himself. Maybe the kid was right. Because for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something he was merely surviving. It felt like something he was looking forward to, and that realization scared him almost as much as it excited him. What Ethan didn't know was that tomorrow morning, Victoria Sterling was going to make a decision, not about Project Halcyon, not about Sterling Automotive, a personal decision, one that would change all of their lives forever. Victoria Sterling arrived at the office before sunrise. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the fact that she spent nearly 20 minutes staring out the window instead of working. Normally, her mornings followed a strict routine: reports, meetings, forecasts, decisions. Today, she found herself thinking about a silver prototype, a lake house, a handwritten letter, and an engineer who somehow managed to complicate her life simply by existing. Her assistant noticed immediately. You're smiling. Victoria looked up. No, I'm not. You are. The assistant placed a folder on her desk. It's alarming. Victoria rolled her eyes. I have work to do. Sure, the assistant smiled knowingly. That's why you've been looking out the window for 20 minutes. Victoria seriously considered finding a new assistant. Unfortunately, she was probably right. Across town, Ethan was having a very different morning. He was losing an argument to an 8-year-old. I'm just saying, Noah announced while pouring cereal, normal people don't drive across the state to solve car mysteries with CEOs. Ethan pointed toward the bowl. Eat breakfast. That's not a counter-argument. It's the only one you're getting. Noah grinned. You like her. Ethan sighed. You have school in 30 minutes. Still not a counter-argument. Parenthood, Ethan decided, was mostly discovering new ways to lose conversations. By mid-morning, Victoria had made up her mind. The decision wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional, at least not entirely. It was simply honest, which felt strangely unfamiliar. She picked up her phone and called Ethan. He answered on the second ring. Hello. Lunch. Silence. That's not a complete sentence. Today. Noon. More silence. Then Ethan laughed. You really don't ask people, do you? Not usually. I've noticed. Victoria smiled despite herself. So? Ethan looked across his workshop. Half-finished projects occupied every available surface. Marcus was currently arguing with a supplier over the phone. Reality. Normal life. Yet somehow lunch sounded more interesting. Okay. Good. Then she hung up. Ethan stared at the phone. Marcus looked over immediately. That was her, wasn't it? Ethan frowned. Everybody needs less information about my life. Marcus laughed. Not a denial. Lunch turned into 3 hours. Not intentionally. It simply happened. They met at a small restaurant overlooking the river. No executives, no engineers, no prototypes, just conversation. Real conversation. The kind people rarely had after years spent pretending they were too busy. Victoria talked about growing Sterling Automotive after her father's death. Ethan talked about starting his business while raising Noah alone. They discussed mistakes, regrets, successes, failures, things neither normally shared. At one point, Victoria laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. Ethan stared. What? She asked. Nothing. That's a lie. Ethan smiled. I forgot you used to laugh like that. Silence followed. Not awkward. Just honest. Victoria looked down briefly, then back up. I forgot a lot of things. Ethan understood exactly what she meant. The afternoon disappeared quickly after that, yet neither seemed eager to leave. Eventually, reality forced the issue. Meetings, responsibilities, life. As they walked toward the parking lot, Victoria stopped suddenly. Come with me tomorrow. Ethan blinked. Where? Company gala. Ethan immediately looked horrified. Victoria laughed. That bad? You said gala. And? That word alone sounds expensive. It is expensive. Ethan groaned. Victoria smiled. Please. The word surprised both of them. She rarely asked anyone for anything. Ethan noticed. So did she. Finally he sighed. Fine. Victoria smiled. A real smile. Not the CEO version. Not the professional version. Something warmer, more personal. Ethan felt his heartbeat do something inconvenient. The following evening, the Sterling Foundation Gala filled one of the largest hotels in the city. Executives, investors, politicians, media personalities. Hundreds of guests occupied a ballroom decorated with enough flowers to finance a small country. Ethan hated every second of it. Relax, Victoria whispered as they entered. Easy for you to say. Why? Ethan gestured broadly. These are your people. Victoria looked around the room, then surprised him. No. Silence. They're really not. Before Ethan could respond, several board members approached. Introductions followed. Conversations followed, yet something strange happened throughout the evening. People kept gravitating toward Ethan, not because he was famous, because he was interesting. He listened, he asked questions. He remembered details, traits increasingly rare in executive circles. At one point, an investor spent nearly 40 minutes discussing manufacturing challenges with him. Another asked about workforce development. A third wanted to hear the Project Halcyon story. Victoria watched the interactions quietly, then finally smiled, because she realized something important. Ethan wasn't exceptional because he solved engineering problems. He was exceptional because he treated everyone the same. CEOs, technicians, investors, children. It didn't matter. Near the end of the evening, the foundation announced a new educational initiative inspired by Project Halcyon. Technical scholarships, apprenticeships, engineering opportunities for students from underserved communities. The audience applauded. Victoria looked toward Ethan. Your fault. He smiled, happy to help. Then the host unexpectedly called both of them onto the stage. Ethan immediately attempted to leave through a side exit. Unfortunately, Victoria caught his arm first. Not happening. Minutes later, they stood beneath bright lights facing hundreds of guests. Ethan looked like a man preparing for dental surgery. Victoria looked amused. The host smiled. Project Halcyon became more than a restoration story. Applause followed. It became a reminder that innovation matters most when it helps people. More applause. Then the host turned toward Ethan. Any final thoughts? Ethan stared. The room waited. Finally, he shrugged. Most important things aren't machines. Silence. They're people. The ballroom grew quiet. Machines can be repaired. Ethan glanced toward Victoria briefly. People need something different. No elaborate speech. No dramatic conclusion. Just truth. Somehow it hit harder than anything else said all evening. The applause that followed lasted a long time. Later, as they stood outside beneath the city lights, Victoria looked toward him. You know what my father would have said? Ethan smiled. Probably something impossible to argue with. She laughed. Definitely. Then her expression softened. He would have liked this. Ethan nodded. Yeah, he would have liked you. Silence settled between them. Comfortable, familiar. Then Victoria took a breath. A decision made. So would I. Ethan looked at her. Really looked at her. And for the first time in 12 years, neither of them looked away. Tomorrow morning, Noah Brooks was going to meet Victoria properly, and neither Ethan nor Victoria had the slightest idea that the 8-year-old was about to become the most important person in the future they were slowly building together. Noah Brooks decided within 7 minutes that Victoria Sterling was acceptable. Ethan would have preferred a longer evaluation period. Unfortunately, nobody had asked him. The meeting happened on a Saturday afternoon at a small lakeside park, halfway between the city and Ethan's neighborhood. Neutral territory. At least that was Ethan's plan. Noah immediately ignored the plan and treated the entire situation like an interview. Victoria arrived carrying sandwiches, lemonade, and enough nervous energy to surprise herself. She had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions with less anxiety. Ethan noticed immediately. You're nervous, Victoria frowned. I'm not nervous. You absolutely are. Before the argument could continue, Noah appeared from the playground carrying a model airplane. He stopped in front of Victoria and studied her carefully. Hi. Hi. Victoria smiled. I've heard a lot about you. Noah nodded. Good things? Ethan groaned. Victoria laughed. Mostly. The interview began immediately. Favorite books. Favorite movies. Favorite foods. Opinions on science museums. Opinions on dogs. Opinions on pancakes. Noah covered every important topic with alarming efficiency. By the time lunch arrived, he seemed satisfied. Victoria had passed inspection. Ethan suspected she had done considerably better than he would have. Hours slipped by. They walked around the lake, fed ducks, watched Noah launch model airplanes from a grassy hill overlooking the water. For the first time in a very long time, everything felt uncomplicated. No mysteries, no deadlines, no hidden compartments, just people enjoying a Saturday afternoon. Eventually, Noah wandered ahead toward the playground again, leaving Ethan and Victoria alone on a nearby bench. The lake reflected sunlight across the water. Children laughed in the distance. The world felt strangely peaceful. Victoria leaned back and watched Noah running across the grass. He's a good kid. Ethan smiled. Yeah. Silence followed. Then Victoria glanced toward him. Claire would be proud. The words hit harder than she intended. Ethan looked down briefly, then nodded. I hope so. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Victoria reached over and gently squeezed his hand. No speeches, no dramatic declarations, just understanding. Sometimes that mattered more. As the afternoon faded toward evening, Noah returned carrying his model airplane. He looked between them suspiciously, then smiled. A dangerous smile. Okay. Ethan immediately recognized trouble. Okay, what? Noah folded his arms. I approve. Victoria burst out laughing. Ethan closed his eyes. Nobody asked. Still. Noah nodded confidently. I approve. The conversation somehow became even worse from there. By sunset, Victoria was laughing harder than she had in years. Noah was entirely pleased with himself, and Ethan had accepted that he would never win another argument as long as the two of them occupied the same side. The following month moved faster than any of them expected. The Project Halcyon story spread across the industry. Sterling Automotive announced a new educational initiative based on Richard Sterling's vision. Scholarships expanded. Apprenticeships opened. Hundreds of students applied. The prototype itself became the centerpiece of a traveling exhibition focused on innovation, engineering, and mentorship. Yet the biggest changes happened away from cameras. Victoria spent more time outside the office. Ethan spent less time trying to carry every responsibility alone. Noah gained another adult who showed up consistently and cared about him deeply. Life didn't transform overnight. It simply became better, one choice at a time, one day at a time. 6 months later, Project Halcyon returned to the Sterling estate for a private ceremony. Employees gathered, engineers gathered, friends and family gathered. The silver prototype sat beneath the evening sky, polished and perfect. A reminder of a journey nobody expected. Douglas Hale stood near the front shaking his head. 7 years. Ethan laughed. You still thinking about that? Douglas pointed toward the car. I spent 7 years trying to fix something that wasn't broken. Victoria smiled. Dad would have loved that. Your father was impossible. Also true. Laughter spread through the group. As sunset painted the horizon gold, Victoria stepped forward to address the crowd. She spoke about Richard Sterling, about engineering, about listening, about the difference between building machines and building relationships. Then she looked toward Ethan and Noah. Project Halcyon taught us something important. The crowd became quiet. The greatest legacies aren't products. Silence followed. They aren't companies. Another pause. They're people. Ethan immediately recognized the line. Richard Sterling's lesson, refined, simplified, passed forward. Victoria smiled. And the people we love are always worth more than the things we build. Applause filled the estate. Not loud, not dramatic, genuine. When it finally ended, Noah stepped forward holding a small framed photograph. The same photograph Richard Sterling had hidden inside the journal. Young Victoria. Young Ethan. Standing beside an old engineering project 12 years earlier, Noah handed it to Victoria, then pointed toward the back. She turned it over. Beneath Richard Sterling's handwriting, someone had added a second sentence. Noah's handwriting. Slightly crooked, perfectly sincere. Some things deserve a second chance. So do people. Victoria laughed through tears. Ethan shook his head. You planned that? Noah smiled proudly. Maybe. They stood together as the last sunlight disappeared behind the trees. Project Halcyon gleamed quietly nearby. The mystery was solved. The journey was finished. Yet somehow it felt less like an ending than a beginning, because Richard Sterling had been right all along. The car was never the legacy. The company was never the legacy. The engineering wasn't the legacy. The legacy was the people who carried those lessons forward. A father who learned to listen. A daughter who learned to let go. A son who reminded everyone what mattered. And a second chance that arrived 12 years later, disguised as an impossible problem nobody else could solve. As the evening settled around them, Ethan slipped an arm around Victoria while Noah launched a model airplane into the golden sky. The small aircraft climbed higher and higher before catching the wind. For a few seconds, it seemed to float effortlessly above everything below. Then all three watched it soar together, and for the first time in a very long time, nobody was searching for an answer anymore. They had already found it. The end.